Part 1. Family Ties. 1. I am going to tell you a story. It has been a long time in the making, and an even longer time in the telling. In fact, this is actually the first time I've been able to relate this story to anyone. I think that after 57 years, it is now safe to tell it. I really don't know. Maybe not. But be that as it may, I am of an age where I really don't care anymore. I just can't keep it inside. I can't live in fear any longer. Consequences be damned. In 1961, I was 10 years old, and life was to be jumped on and ridden like a wild bronco, tearing through life with all the laughter and enthusiasm only a child could muster. A young boy with not a care in the world. Back then, being a child lasted a long time. Our time wasn't structured with playdates and scripted activities as it is now. You just left the house after breakfast and returned for dinner with nothing more than a, "Bye, Mom, I'm going out with the guys." It was a world of adventure and imagination. A simple life. At some point, there would be a time when that would change. Whether it be an incident or an experience, that event would end that magical world of childhood and would thrust you unsuspectingly into adulthood. And no, not real chronological adulthood, but a point where the warm safety of childishness disappeared, and you saw life in a whole new way. A way in which things weren't simple. A way in which things were very, very troublesome and complicated. It was the moment when you realized that all those imagined childhood monsters under the bed were very real. Maybe not the same way as when you were a child, but nonetheless, their sharp, needle-like teeth were still perfectly capable of tearing you asunder. My point came at the tender age of 14. It wasn't an event or a terrible loss of a loved one that caused mine. It was a young man my own age. His name was Joey Pittman, and he was my best friend. 2. When I was 10 years old, Joey and his father moved into town. We lived in a relatively old city that was located along the Passaic River, which ran through the northern part of our state. Patterson, the city above us on the river, was an old textile manufacturing giant in the 19th and early 20th centuries. Our town of Hillcrest used to be an old trading stop on the river that grew to house the workers in the textile mills of Patterson. By the 1930s, the textile industry had left the area, and the former silk capital of America withered and died. The city became a depressed, decaying hulk of its former self, filled with abandoned, rotting factories and empty storefronts. Bad for the city and its economy, but great for young boys to go exploring. You just couldn't tell your parents what you were doing because they would be horrified to learn that their young progeny were climbing all over the discarded machinery and rusting balconies. For us, life as a preteen in Hillcrest was our American dream. In the 1930s, they started tearing down the old workers' row houses and cold water flats. By the 1950s, there were numerous houses built in their stead, mostly two-family houses and duplexes. But that showed us that Hillcrest was a town no longer owing its existence to Patterson, and no longer in its shadow. I remember the first day that I laid eyes on Joey Pittman. It was the third week of school. I attended elementary school number 11 and was just starting 5th grade. My parents and I lived in one of the duplexes that had sprung up like mushrooms. We were in the Riverview section of town. It was one of the older sections near Patterson and the banks of the turbid Passaic River. The school was just a block and a half away from our house, and I always walked to school myself. That was just the way it was done back then. Carrying my books in a Davy Crockett lunchbox, I walked to the traffic light on Wabash Street. That was one of the main streets in our section of town and was where all of the stores and shops were located. As we waited for the traffic officer to cross us children, I said hello to several members of my class. Back then, the same groups of students were kept together from kindergarten through the 6th grade. "Hey, Davy, Chris," I said, nodding to two of the boys in my class. "Hi, June." I smiled at a cute, curly-haired blonde girl that I kind of liked. She smiled back. Just then, another boy walked up. He was standing a little apart from us. Several little kids were between us. He was shorter than I, with straight, dark hair combed away from his face. I had never seen him before. Looking at Davy and Chris, I tilted my head toward the new kid. They just shrugged their shoulders. Finally, the light changed and the crossing guard walked to the center of the street. She blew her whistle and held up her hands to stop traffic. Her red stop sign was held up importantly. We all crossed the intersection and walked the half a block to the 50-year-old brick building that was our elementary school. It was in the shape of a U with 2 wings and a connecting section. The first wing held the younger children and administration offices, while the rest were for the older children. The basement was used as a gym on rainy or snowy days. A new addition was being built that was to be an actual gymnasium, but it wouldn't be finished for another few months. Walking into the side playground for the older grades, we separated into groups segregated by age. The first thing we all did was to see where Butch was. Butch was Bobby Napoli, the school bully. Universally called Butch by everyone, including his parents, he was the #1 nemesis of every school number 11 student within his sight. His motto must have been, "None too small, none too timid," because he terrorized the school like an adolescent Attila the Hun. It was very prudent to always know where he was at all times. After 10 minutes, the school bell rang. We all lined up according to grades and filed into the side doors of the building. The babbling of voices filled the halls, and we all greeted each other and shared our adolescent news of the day. As I took my seat, I noticed that the new kid was standing at the front of the class. Mrs. Weeks, our 5th grade teacher, was standing next to him, with her hand resting on his slight shoulders. As everyone now noticed him, the volume of talking raised. He looked very uncomfortable standing up there. "Who's the new weirdo?" I heard Butch's voice sneer from the back of the class. Mrs. Weeks put her hand up as she said in a raised voice, Now, class. Settle down and take your seats. Hurry up. That's right." Everyone quickly sat down at their desks. One boy, Chris, was about to sit when Mrs. Weeks said to him, No, Christopher. You have a new seat. It's up there, right at the front of that row. Leave the seat next to Richard empty." Oh, great, I thought. The new kid is next to me. That was actually okay, really. Chris was the class clown, and as funny and amusing as it was to be seated next to him, it was extremely distracting in the long run. It's hard to concentrate on schoolwork when the guy next to you is constantly making you snicker. Mrs. Weeks guided Joey over, and he self-consciously took a seat at the desk next to mine. I gave him a small wave and a smile, and he responded in kind. The teacher walked back to the front of the class, and the new school day resumed. At midday recess, we all filed outside to eat our lunches. As I wound up next to Joey in line, we started talking. "Hi," I said. "My name is Richie." He smiled and said, "Hi, Richie. I'm Joey." Joey was a little shorter than I and kind of skinny. "Did you just move to Hillcrest?" I asked. "Yeah," Joey replied. "My dad and I just moved in with my grandma. He's going to start working at the Aero bus company in town as a mechanic. He is good at fixing engines and stuff." "Cool," I said. Where does your grandma live? Oh, we're down near the river, on Post Road. Really? I replied. I kinda live near there too. Neat, he said. The Passaic River is right across the street from me. Knitting my brows while thinking, I pictured the location he was describing. Before I could respond, my friend Davy walked up. You live on Post Road? He said to Joey as he approached us. In that big, white house? Smiling, Joey said, Yeah, that's the one. Really? I gasped. Yeah, why? That house is supposed to be haunted, Davy said. Joey looked surprised and then a bit taken aback. He seemed to think about that fact for a second and then smiled. No, he said, chuckling. It's not haunted. My grandma has lived there for a while. It's a nice house. I'm sure she would have said something if that were true. Well, it's a really old house anyway, I replied lamely. Yeah, that's true, Joey started. But Just then, as we three were focused on the conversation, Butch Napoli sauntered over. We had inadvertently forgotten about him, and he had obviously overheard our discussion. Hey, new kid, he said loudly, bumping Davy out of the way with his shoulder. He planted himself squarely in front of Joey. Did you just say that you live in that big, old haunted house down by the river? Joey looked at him and said, Yeah, but it's really not Ha! Butch laughed snidely. Bullshit. I saw that old lady who lives there. I bet she's a witch. Everybody knows that. Joey lost all trace of his smile. Butch's taunts obviously made him angry. That old spook house has been haunted for years. Even my dad said that. Butch stood there smugly, waiting for Joey to say something. But the new kid stood there, staring at him. Davy and I had unconsciously taken a step back, lest we catch the unfortunate attention of our very own Attila the Hun. Butch started to look a bit perturbed that his tirade was not having the desired effect on his new victim. Giving Joey his meanest grimace, Butch leaned in and jabbed his finger at his chest. Yeah, well, you better not mess with me, weirdo, or I'll give you a good beating. Joey simply stared at him with a neutral yet tense expression. We all waited for Butch to do something. It wasn't going to be pretty. But Butch seemed to waver for a second. Then, turning his head slightly to the right, he focused on a figure 10 feet away. It was Eugene from our class. He was a quiet kid, large and overweight. Eugene was Butch's usual target for torment. It was a shame how much abuse he took. I've always hated bullies, and it actually made me nauseous to see that kind of random harassment take place. What the unfortunate and humiliating truth was, for me and for the rest of us, was that we were all relieved that it was Eugene that usually bore the brunt of Butch's wrath, and not one of us. Sad, but true. Hey, Butch yelled out, Fatty! Eugene stiffened and then hurried away from us. Hey, lardass, yeah, you! You better have some cookies for me in that bag. I told you yesterday to bring me cookies. With that, Butch turned and walked away from us. He was now focused on new prey. I saw one of the teachers turn and watched what was about to ensue. She started to slowly walk their way. Meanwhile, Davy, Joey, and I walked in the other direction. No one ever wanted to be at the epicenter of one of Butch's problems. Joey looked back over his shoulder as we walked, but I said to him, You just met Butch. Do yourself a favor and stay away from him. He's a bully and nothing but trouble. Believe me, he's mean. Joey looked back at me and said woodenly, I've seen worse. We sat back down on a low concrete wall at the other end of the playground. I knew of the house that Joey's grandmother, and now Joey, lived in. It was very different than most houses in the area, and it always fascinated me. She lived in one of the original houses that were erected along the banks of the Passaic River by the owners of the textile mills in Patterson. I remembered seeing pictures of them in the Hillcrest Public Library. There were about a half dozen of them built in the late 1800s. The silk barons had built them on prime real estate at the time, so they could be apart from the hoi polloi, yet near their beloved nest eggs. Most looked to be magnificent old Victorians. Their wealthy owners went by the names of Van Buren, Cutler, Turner, and Van Dyke, as opposed to the largely Irish, Italian, and Eastern Europeans that moved in to work in the mills of Patterson. By the time I was born, all of the homes had been torn down, save for two. The first was a stately old Victorian that was just on the Patterson side of the border and had been converted into a fancy restaurant. The second was a large, rambling, pre-Victorian farmhouse-style domicile that featured a wraparound front porch and a beautiful center staircase, which ran up and around the formal entryway. This was the old Cutler House that dominated the rise on a 2-block parcel of land fronting Post Road and the river. In its heyday, it must have been absolutely magnificent. Now, it was a badly aging matron whose better days were long, long past. All of us local children believed that it was haunted. Joey's grandmother had purchased it back in 1953 and had lived there ever since. By now, the school bell had rung, signaling the end of recess, and without further event, we filed back into the building to continue the school day. Lifting the corner of the fence, I squeezed my way through severed mesh. Not wanting to tear my shirt, I maneuvered my way in carefully. Last week, I caught the tail of my print t-shirt sneaking through and tore a small hole in it. When I came home, my mother gave me hell for being so careless. It was just a little hole and didn't really bother me, but my mother was certainly not a happy camper. But she had dutifully sewed up the tear with thread. Now it was back in my dresser drawer and blessed with a second life. I had just come from digging around in the extensive excavation that the state was undertaking to put in a new exit ramp off the relatively new Garden State Parkway that ran through Hillcrest and Patterson in our part of the state. They had dug up a massive portion of area near the river. Several old mills were demolished to make way for the new extension. At this stage in my life, I had begun fossil collecting. The year before it was coins, and the year before that, stamps. But now, with the purchase for my birthday of a picture book about dinosaurs, I had realigned my life's passion into a hunt for dinosaur bones and fossils. I wouldn't know a Stegosaurus vertebrae from a sandstone rock, but that didn't deter me from digging away in any new construction site or gravel pit. I would sacrifice all for the sake of science. And the chance to find some cool bones. Now I had just entered the abandoned mill nearest my house. The fact that it was fenced off and plastered with foreboding-looking warning signs didn't stop me, nor any other boy, from sneaking in and climbing all over the structure. I could already hear young voices calling and laughing as I entered through a jimmied open metal door. Clambering over a couple of girders lying in the middle of the floor and several old machines of unknown purpose, I climbed up the rusty metal stairs to the second floor. There were rows of old looms and other textile manufacturing machines in the vast space. A balcony wound its way around the peripheral area with thick metal crossbeams connecting the walkways. Several boys were laughing and weaving their way across the myriad of interlocking girders high above me. They seemed to be a few years older than me. "This way," one of them shouted. Apparently a game of follow the leader was taking place as a line of 4 boys crossed over one of the beams to the other side. They all had their hands held out from their sides for balance, as there was nothing to hold on to but air. The leader reached the end and grasped the rusting rail around the balcony. Bending his knees, he vaulted over onto the walkway. You could hear the metal screech and rattle with his effort. From somewhere along the metal railing, a loose screw popped out and fell, bouncing off one of the old looms with a loud clang, and roll noisily across the floor. As I looked to see where it fell, I noticed Joey Pittman standing off to the side, watching the four boys also. I loved roaming the banks of the Passaic River and exploring the gloomy hulks of the abandoned textile mills. I certainly wasn't one of those more bravado than brains type of kids who would swing upside down from a rusty girder above some spiky, dirty loom, but I did enjoy watching others do so. Truthfully, I didn't possess the nerve to either impale or crush myself on some infernal machine. As I walked over to Joey, he noticed me and smiled. "Hi," I said. "So you found one of our playgrounds?" "Yeah," he laughed. "Just waiting to see who falls." I thought that was hilarious and burst out laughing. He smiled wider, seemingly pleased with my reaction. "You really have to be nuts to do that," I said, pointing to the four boys high above us. They were all vaulting over the rail one after the other. With each leap, the tortured metal pipe seemed to sway more. "Wouldn't catch me doing that either," Joey said. "Smart man," I said, sagely. We talked for a little longer when I heard a familiar voice from below. "Come on, what are you, chicken?" "Uh-oh," I groaned. We looked at each other. It was Butch. It was about 2 weeks after Joey's first day in school. There was no further incident between Butch and Joey, but for the usual compilation of random taunts and arm punches that Butch seemed to give generously to everyone he passed. "Let's go down the other stairs," I said to Joey, pointing to the far side of the vast room. I could hear Butch and whoever he was with below starting for the stairway that I had just ascended. "I'll do it first, just to show you guys it's no big deal," Butch's voice echoed through the building. "Don't chicken out on me, or I'll give you a good beating." I thought, there's that old threat again. I remembered once the year before when I was with my dad in Vince's hardware store in town. He was looking for some shelving for the basement, and I had accompanied him on his search. While my father was deciding between 2 different types of brackets, which honestly looked exactly the same to me, I heard a raised voice. Peeking around the display of hand tools, I saw Butch and his father in the next aisle over. His father appeared angry at something and had a hold of Butch's arm. His meaty hand was wrapped around Butch's bicep, and from the boy's expression, I could see that his father was squeezing him awfully hard. Speaking through clenched teeth, so as not to attract too much attention, his father hissed, "Don't test me, boy. I'm warning you. You do, and I'll give you a good beating." My father came over and gently pulled me back. He looked at Mr. Napoli, who was unaware of us, with disgust, and said to me in a low voice, "Come on, son. I have what I need. Let's go." I looked up at him, and his expression softened. He gave me a small smile and pulled me close as we left. I never forgot that exchange, and the fact that his father's words were repeated verbatim to everybody that Butch saw. In that moment, remembering the terrified expression on our bully's face, I knew what his life must have been like and felt sorry for him. That sentiment lasted until the next day, when he knocked the books out of my arms coming home from school. Joey and I made it down the stairs and out of the old mill without problem. I showed him 3 stones that I found and had in my pocket. One rock had a small trilobite fossil embedded in its surface, and I was quite proud of it. We talked about rocks and dinosaurs on the way home. Then we split, he going his way and I mine. Joey seemed like a nice guy. I liked him. A week after that, Joey's good fortune ended. After spending a Saturday goofing around the old mills again with Joey and another classmate, we were heading home. The other boy had separated from us as he lived in the other direction. Joey and I were walking down Post Road towards our houses. Suddenly, from nowhere, we heard a familiar voice. "Hey, weirdos!" For a second, I contemplated hightailing it home, but we were still 2 blocks from Joey's house, and mine was another 4 blocks after his. With no other recourse, we both turned around to meet whatever dire fate awaited us. Butch Napoli appeared from behind some trees near the corner we had just passed. He had a smile on his face that was very unpleasant to behold. "Well, look who I ran into," he said smugly. "It's the 2 jerks from school. Where do you think you're going?" Hi, Butch," I stammered. "We were just heading home. We don't want to be late." I glanced at Joey, but he just stood there silently. I could tell that he wasn't any happier seeing this bully than I was. Butch swaggered up, chin thrust out and shoulders back like a bulldog. He acted as if he had all the time in the world. He never really picked on me too much, at least not like he did to Eugene and some of the other smaller kids. But you never really knew with him when your turn would come. As he approached, Butch shoved me aside disdainfully. He seemed focused on Joey today. Since that first altercation, Butch hadn't bothered Joey except to occasionally make fun of his family and where he lived. Today, I could see that this was going to be the new kid's comeuppance. "Heading home to the old spook house, are you?" said Butch, lip curled in a sneer. Joey didn't say anything. "Gonna see what that old witch is up to?" he continued. I could see Joey's jaw clench and could tell that he was mad. I guess Butch had hit a sore spot. "Hey, Butch," I said tentatively. "We really have to go home." "I'm not talking to you, Nimrod," Butch growled, glancing briefly at me. "You looking for a good beating?" I certainly wasn't looking for that, and took a step back. Focusing back on Joey, Butch said, "That ugly old crone gonna go ride on her broomstick?" He chuckled at his cleverness. "Maybe she'll turn into a bat." "Shut up!" Joey shouted. "Don't talk about my grandma that way!" Now finally getting the response he was looking for, Butch moved in. He shoved Joey hard on his shoulder. "Asswipe," Butch barked out. "Did you just tell me to shut up? Me?" He punched Joey in the chest. At that escalation, I stepped away. As I had said before, I really didn't consider Joey to be my friend at that point. He was just a guy I went to school with, and I didn't want to incur a good beating for no reason. Joey started to turn around to continue going home. "Where do you think you're going, stupid?" Butch said. "I'm not done with you yet." He reached out and grabbed a hold of Joey's shirt. As he spun him around, Joey threw a haymaker punch that caught Butch on the cheek. Time seemed to stop. That wild punch bought Joey about 10 seconds of Butch's wide-eyed surprise. Then, lips compressed with rage, Butch began pummeling the smaller boy. Joey tried to do the best that he could, but was no match for his stockier assailant. In no time, Joey was beaten to the ground. As I had said, I had always hated bullies and couldn't stand to watch somebody get picked on. When he kicked Joey onto his back and then bent down to continue beating him, I couldn't just stand there and do nothing. Rushing at Butch, I pushed him off the still flailing Joey. They were at the edge of the sidewalk by that time. Shoving him as hard as I could, Butch stumbled in surprise and his feet went off the side of the curb. His legs tangled and he fell into the street. Hitting his head on the asphalt, Butch winced. I helped Joey up. Butch then rose and came at us again. By now, both Joey and I were desperately, but effectively, windmilling our fists at Butch. Seeing this unexpected resistance and realizing that this was now much too difficult for him to handle, Butch took a couple of steps back and pointed menacingly at us. His face was beet red with both exhaustion and humiliation. This was obviously a first for him. "You just wait," he yelled. "You just wait. I'll fix both of you. You won't get away with this. I'll give both of you a good beating for this. You just wait and see." Butch continued to back up while spluttering out his threats. Realizing that we had just barely succeeded in getting away with our teeth intact, I grabbed Joey and we swiftly walked away. Now that the adrenaline was ebbing, we both were starting to shake. Joey bent over and put his hands on his knees. I thought he was going to be sick, but he was crying softly. He was in pain, and I could see that his face was swelling and his nose was bleeding. I really felt sorry for him, although Joey was a tough little guy. When he stood, he wavered a bit. He had really taken a beating, so I put my arm around his shoulders to steady him. "I'm a little dizzy," he said. "It's okay," I replied. "I'll take you to your house." With my arm around him, we walked the 2 blocks back to his house. Occasionally, cars would pass us as we trudged along Post Road. I could smell the damp, rotting vegetation from the river as we walked. The Passaic River got more and more polluted every year. The factories and mills along the waterway always used the river as their dumping grounds. Finally, we reached the house and I helped him up the 3 steps from the sidewalk and across the cement walkway to his grandmother's house up on the rise. We climbed the wooden stairs of the wide, wraparound porch, and we were almost to the door when it opened. In the doorway stood Joey's grandmother. She had a shocked and concerned look on her face. "Oh, dear Lord," she exclaimed, taking a step out onto the porch. "Joey, what happened to you?" "I'm okay, Grandma," he mumbled. "Oh, you certainly are not," she said. She was a stocky lady, about 5'6", with longish brown hair that was mostly gray. It was wrapped in a bun in the back. His grandma was wearing a cotton house dress with a small navy floral print. She smelled like lavender. "Come inside and I'll tend to your bruises," she said as she took over, guiding him. I stood awkwardly at the foot of the portal. When turning to me, she said in a neutral voice, "Well, don't just stand there. Come on inside." As I followed them in, my eyes grew wide. I knew from seeing the outside of his house in the past that it was large, but I was unprepared for the interior. As his grandmother led him through the pantry and into the kitchen, I paused, looking around. Off to my right and left were 2 rooms. One I later learned was the parlor, while the other was the living room. In between was this incredible central staircase that led upstairs to the 2nd floor. It was wide with heavy newels at the foot. The banisters continued up and around the upstairs hall. It may not have been grand to some people, but in my brief and obviously shuttered life, it was the biggest staircase that I had ever seen. It reminded me of the one in the Capitol Theater I used to go to for Saturday matinees. As I stood there gawking, his grandmother called out, "Come along." Entering the kitchen, I saw her sit Joey down at the table and opened the refrigerator door. She pulled out an aluminum tray of ice cubes and yanked the handle up, freeing them. She wrapped these in a towel and held them gently to his face. "Otis," she called out. "Otis, go upstairs and bring down the first aid kit from the bathroom next to my bedroom." I could hear feet pounding up the stairs and across the hall. Seconds later, I again heard them come running down the staircase. She was looking closely at Joey and assessing the damage. A gawky-looking teenager entered into the kitchen, carrying a white box with the big red cross on it. "Here, Grandma Pittman," he said. As she took the box and opened it, I looked at the young man. He was very homely, with a gap-toothed smile and heavy-lidded eyes. He seemed a little slow, what my father used to call a mouth breather. While she dabbed iodine on Joey's cuts, his grandmother looked over at me with a no-nonsense expression. "All right, young man, what happened to my grandson?" she asked me. Her stern voice rattled me, and I told her, "It was the school bully, Butch. He came up to us and started picking on Joey. Then he began beating him up." She looked at Joey carefully and held his shoulders. "Is this true, Joey?" He nodded his head and said to her, "Yeah, Grandma. He was making fun of you. I tried to fight him, but he was too big. Richie saved my life. He jumped right in and knocked him off of me. He would have really killed me if it weren't for Richie. He's my friend." I thought this was a bit of an exaggeration and a huge leap of faith, but kept that to myself. His grandmother's stern look softened as she looked back at me. She gave me a warm smile. "Is that so?" she said softly. I smiled back, relieved that I wasn't going to get yelled at for anything. As she continued putting ice on his bruises, she said, "Well, Richie, you can call me Grandma Pittman. You're a good boy and a good friend to my Joey. Now I want you to tell me about this bully in school." I started telling her about Butch and his reign of terror at our school. She insisted on a recreation of the attack at least twice. Grandma Pittman bridled at the story and pursed her lips together as I told her about his making fun of Joey. Boy, she was mad. I could tell. She wanted to know all about him. What was his name? Where did he live? I figured that she was going to march over to the Napoli residence and ream out the entire household. That made me smile to myself, and I unloaded all my feelings about our school bully. Joey would nod his head and occasionally add to my description. I told her about running into him at the old mills. She asked what we were doing there, but I made sure she knew Joey and I weren't doing anything stupid. After grilling me about Butch, she looked at Joey's face. The swelling was already looking better. It didn't seem to be as bad as I had first thought. She insisted that I stay for dinner that night and wouldn't take no for an answer. When Joey's dad came home from work, she took him into the parlor and told him quietly about our altercation. He looked mad, but nothing more was said of it. During dinner, she wanted to know all about me. She was initially a bit intimidating, but she really was a sweet lady. I noticed that she had a southern accent, and when I mentioned it, she told me she was originally from Texas. I thought that was neat and wanted to ask her if she ever knew any real cowboys, but I didn't want to sound like a little kid. Joey's dad seemed nice too, although he didn't really say much. He had the same accent as his mother, although not as pronounced. He thanked me for helping his boy. After dinner, Joey and I talked for a bit. I couldn't stay long because my mom told me to come home before dark, after I called her to say that I was invited. We sat on the stairs in the back of the house. They overlooked a long driveway that ran from Post Road to Haines Street, which ran parallel to the back of the property. The house sat on a huge piece of land. Although all of the land across from the driveway was overgrown and wooded, the land around the house wasn't too bad. There was a large barn type of structure behind the house and two more small outbuildings behind that. Along the perimeter of the 2-block piece of land were trees and hedges that were starting to encroach into the rest of the area. I noticed a large flower garden in the back that seemed to be meticulously taken care of. Joey said it was his grandma's pride and joy. Otis came outside and asked if Joey was okay. Yeah, Joey said distractedly. I'm fine, Otis. You can go inside. After he left, I asked, Is Otis your big brother? Laughing, Joey replied, My brother? No. He's just a cousin, is all. Here for a while visiting. I couldn't help myself. You don't seem to like him very much, I said. Joey nonchalantly shrugged his shoulders. He's okay, I guess. He's just a little slow. He lived in Jacksonville, Florida, with his mom. Your aunt? I asked. No, not really, he said. They're more like distant cousins. Anyway, I guess his dad left or something. Grandma said his mom couldn't find work, and she offered to take him for a while. Some kind of trouble down there, or something. Grandma was really good friends with his grandmother, so she helped them out. Wow, I said admiringly. Your grandma is a really nice lady. Yeah, she's great, he said. You'll see. She always has family coming and going in this house, like a hotel, he said, laughing. That day really sealed the deal between Joey and me. He had called me his friend, and I guess I was. We started hanging out together all of the time after that. My family was small, so having all kinds of family staying over was a new experience for me. It sounded like fun.